Well, it looks like we've got a great number of people who have already logged in. We've got lots to cover today. So we are broadcasting nationwide. And so, depending where you are, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our event, Post Election Political and Economic Impacts. My name's Corinne Acock, and I'm on the marketing team here at Avenue, and I'll be your moderator. For 40 years, Avenue has served state and local governments, and we've built a client base that's 3,000 jurisdictions strong today, giving us an understanding of what's weighing on the minds of government leaders, especially now that midterms are over, which is what's next. Now, there is no escaping inflation, not at the gas pump, not at the grocery store, not even on Amazon anymore. And we understand you face the same issues that we do. But we also understand that you have the extraordinary responsibility of planning and managing for your communities and for the citizens you serve in very trying circumstances. Now, that's why Avenue has partnered with the UCLA Anderson Forecast, an organization with a 70-year history of producing some of the most accurate forecasts for our country, so that together we can bring you meaningful insight. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's guest speakers. Dr. Jerry Nicholsberg, Director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, Dr. Leo Feller, Senior Economist with UCLA Anderson Forecast, and Avenue's very own Fran Mancia, Vice President of Government Relations. You can learn more about our presenters in the briefing doc we sent to you in your reminder emails. Now, today's format is going to be a panel presentation, no slides. We have 5 main topic areas we're going to cover, and in between each topic, we'll pause for commentary between the panelists, and for any questions you have, just use the chat feature. We'll be covering the topics in the following order so you can get any questions ready. Political and legislative update, economic uncertainty and recession outlook, inflation and supply chain, housing market, and unemployment. Now, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to keep us moving so we can cover as much material as possible. And with that, I'd like to kick it off with Fran Mancia, who's going to cover the political and legislative update. Fran, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you, Corinne. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and with Dr. Jerry and Dr. Leo, great people who we have the honor of working with. Just as a start, this has been a very unusual election cycle. I've been doing this for quite a few years, well before my hair turned gray. But what we've really seen in this current session is there was an exodus of incumbents across the country prior to the election. A quarter of the state lawmakers across the state are leaving office by the end of 2022. Some for term limits, some due to retirements. A lot of the dynamics were around redistricting and opting out against running against people from their same party, things of that type. So just in comparison, we're at 26% higher retirements this time than compared to the last time we had redistricting 10 years ago. So we saw a lot of traditional Republicans running against conservative challengers and progressive Democrats against moderate Democrats. In all, there were 6,300 state legislative races across the country, 46 states. And so we're going to have a lot of new changes going forward. So then the question really becomes, will this lead to a change in public policy? And that's yet to be determined, obviously. Dynamics and control in the House and Senate are very important. We've seen the election results, even as of last night and this morning, we're seeing some of the final seats coming through. So what I feel, it's really going to come down to a willingness to compromise and work across the aisle, both in state houses and at the federal level. And that's really going to determine if anything significant is going to be passed into law. So just, some of the key issues I'm sure we're well aware, but it's important to talk about: the right to choose, the ability to set election rules at the state level, ability to raise or lower taxes, then determining what could be taught in public schools were major issues at the state level. Key constituent concerns, I think we're all aware, certainly the economy, cost of living, the right to choose, and democracy. What's the future of democracy as a whole? So just as a perspective, this was also the most expensive election in our history. $16.7 billion were spent at the state and federal level. This is double the amount that was spent, for perspective, in 2010. It's fascinating. Of this, $1.1 billion came from a small group of individual donors, both from the Democratic and Republican candidates. So some small groups of very wealthy people had a major impact on the contributions. So how does the state power look? Republicans have the majority in 23 states, Democrats the majority in 17. The full control before the pre-election, Republicans had 23 and the Democrats 14, and 13 houses are divided. That hasn't really changed in this election, just to share that. So the state levels are pretty evenly distributed. What we did see were 3 houses went from red to blue. The Michigan House and Senate went from red to blue, as did the Minnesota Senate. However, in 2021, the Virginia House turned GOP. So at the end of the day, it's not so much a shift from R's to D's, but rather a further consolidation under single party rule across the country. So at the end of the day, what do the results tell us? And in my view, it simply comes down to democracy was on the ballot and it won. The nation was not as polarized as many people thought, but we're certainly divided in viewpoints. Results were also more balanced than pundits predicted. The red wave didn't materialize, but voter turnout was much higher than predicted. And I think key groups that really came out that people weren't expecting, or perhaps were, but were not factoring in, were women and Gen Xers really came out in full force. In 2022, had the highest young voter turnout in the past 30 years. And in the battleground states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Nevada, the 18 to 29-year-old voters came out 31%, and that's double what they did in 2018. So, but the groups that are 30 to 44 split votes evenly between Democrats and Republicans, and people over 45 years old tended to lean Republican. So those are major things to talk about and consider, see where this takes us. But what I think really matters is balance, cooperation, a sense of respect for divergent views. I think will be major plays in there. And there are some good signs that for collaboration in the legislature. Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, both on the polar opposite sides of the political spectrum in terms of views, are working together on a bill to regulate social media reform. There's a lot of concern about social media giving too much power to the fringes on both the far left and on the far right, and they're having potential impacts on society. So we're seeing some potential workings of people who normally wouldn't be considered collaborative. Senator Graham also stated the other day that we have a divided government. Maybe we can do something with it. I think that's an important statement. So what does all this mean for the economy in terms of inflation and recessions? And I'm hopeful that stability and moderation will help and matter as we go forward. So we'll see where that goes, and we'll sense it from there. So at this point, I think I'd like to turn it back over to Karine, but it's been a very interesting dynamic. The last thing I'll say is the political spectrum is not over. It's going to continue to change in the coming days, but I'm optimistic that things can work together. But I think we'll be working on smaller issues, maybe around prescription drug prices or the economy, things of that nature. The bigger issues that are more controversial are going to take some time to settle down, and then we'll see how the leadership shakes out in the House and the Senate at the federal level. So with that, Karine, I'll send it back to you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Fran. Actually, why don't we all go on the screen on this one? But I do have a couple of questions for you. I love how you said democracy is on the ballot. I think that captured and sums up things very well. There seems to have been a return to honorably conceding this time around, or am I wrong? Is that trending back? Is that do you see that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm hopeful that will be the case. It was interesting to see some concession speeches were very graceful, and people are accepting the results, which I think is important. That's certainly not to say that there isn't issues around some elections that need to be looked at carefully. I think democracy has always worked on a base of respect in general in the past, and the rhetoric has been turned down a bit for now, but that can certainly switch. But I am hopeful that we're on a good trajectory in that regard.
All right. And then one other question for you, and then I'm going to give Leo and Jerry a chance to ask anything if they'd like to. Does a legislator have the ability to impact positive change to the economy?
Yes, I think they do. And I think the voters expect them to work together and collaborate, which is sort of the basis of what I've been speaking about. But they really want them to work on things like financial stability, job opportunities, health and housing, creating things that better the life of our citizenry, and perhaps set the rhetoric aside. Those are things we can work on over time. But let's get to work right now on things that really matter and have a direct impact on people's lives. And I think the outcome of the elections sort of dictated that.
All right. All right. I'm actually going to keep us moving so we're on target to get to all of our topics. So thank you very much. Next
Sure.
up is Jerry, who's going to talk to us about economic uncertainty in these current times and the recession outlook. Are we in one? Is one coming? Can we avoid it? So thank you, Jerry. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Corinne. And it is a pleasure to be here with our friends at Avenue. Always a pleasure. So there are two topics that you sent over to me. One is uncertainty and the other is recession. And I think it's worthwhile to start with uncertainty. Why is there so much uncertainty today? And why is that different from, say, the recent past, or as we were looking at and trying to forecast whether or not there was going to be a recession in other times? And the answer to that question is that we are still on the way out of the 2020 recession, which was a pandemic-induced recession. And we haven't had one of those since 1919, or from the period 1919 through 2022. And that was 100 years ago, a very different economy. And we didn't have the kinds of data resources that we have today. So we're receiving a lot of data. The data is somewhat mixed. But does suggest that, at least for the moment, we're in a strong economy. But we have to be really careful with that data and try and understand what's going on with the data. What is it telling us? What is it not telling us? Because it's data on something that's different than what we've seen in certainly in the last 50 years. And that's where we get all of this uncertainty about what is going to happen next with the economy. So the question about recession, I think it's useful because there's a lot of talk and it really is a lot of opinion about, were we in a recession? Are we in a recession? Will we be in one? A recession is about a contraction in economic activity. It is idle labor, people being laid off and not working. And it is about idle capital, companies scaling back, but scaling back in such a way that some of the equipment and software that they have is not being utilized. And if you look at the first 9 months of 2022, you don't see any of that. We have more capital than before, more plant and equipment, more software, and capacity utilization is not falling. We have more people employed every month, more people employed. We have layoff rates are historically low, unemployment rate historically low. None of these suggest that the economy is contracting. What they do suggest, which goes back to what I was saying about uncertainty, is those GDP numbers in the first half of this year have some sampling or measurement error in them, because none of the other economic indicators suggest that we had 2 quarters of contraction in the US economy. What about going forward? Well, going forward, some of the uncertainty has to do with a new element, something we haven't seen since the 1980s, which is Federal Reserve policy that is anti-inflation policy. Normally, we get a recession because of overbuilding. That is, we have built too many homes, and we saw that certainly in 2008, 2009, or we build too much in the way of software and computers and silicon chips, as in 2001, or too much in the way of defense goods, as in 1990, 1947, 1953. We don't have any of that now. But we do have policy that is anti-inflation policy. And I know we're going to talk about inflation in more depth soon. And that policy can be changed. So right now, the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates aggressively. If they continue that for a long period of time, history tells us that induces a recession because it affects interest-sensitive sectors such as housing, which we'll talk about in more depth, automobiles, and business investment. But the Federal Reserve is not bound to do that. They can change policy. And so we're thinking about, for our December 7th forecast release, exploring alternative Federal Reserve policies and what the implications are. But right now, in this quarter, we're definitely not in a recession, and all of the data points to strong demand, followed by, just to kind of conclude this segment, a 2023 where we're going to start to see increased government purchases in the areas of infrastructure and in defense goods purchases. So on top of this relatively healthy economy, we have two new demand elements coming in. And so, circling back to uncertainty, all of this means we have an uncertain 2023, and we need to evaluate the data carefully as it comes in and pay more attention to that than to opinion. So
Thank you very much.
You.
Making sure we don't have any audio issues. Thank you very much, Jerry. So we're going to come back. I've got a couple of questions for you. In your experience, have you seen this much uncertainty before in the past? Have you, and if so, when have you seen a period like this?
So in my experience, the answer is no.
Okay.
This is really is uncharted territory. And I didn't speak about the international uncertainty, which is even greater than domestic uncertainty and geopolitical uncertainty. But if you go back to the period from 1914 to 1925, you see a world that is in turmoil and an economy that's in turmoil. And there you do see that kind of uncertainty, even though it's a very different world from today. So that's we haven't seen this in any of our lifetimes, unless there's someone on the webinar that's over 100 years old.
Thank you. And then, are there signs in the economic data that remote work is redistributing taxable income between states and local jurisdictions?
Well, so this is an interesting question, and I would say that the jury is still out, but here is what we're seeing. In 2020, when people were told you can work from anywhere for the next year, they decided to work from anywhere in some nice places. Now, managers are seeing that there is a real benefit to being in the office, to having that collaborative, creative, and cultural experience. And so there is a move towards hybrid work, and a fairly strong move towards hybrid work. And that trend seems to have some legs to it. What that means, to get to the heart of your question, is that, living in Grand Junction, Colorado, and working in Manhattan is probably not going to work. And when we do have a recession, whenever that might be, those remote workers who don't have that connection with the office are liable to be the ones who are laid off first. And so there's a real incentive to be closer geographically, even if you're only coming into the office 2 to 3 times a week. But that geographical closeness does mean that you don't necessarily have to live in the city core. You can live a little distance away. I know that here in California, there are people who are looking at living in Sacramento and working in San Francisco. And that's quite doable 2 to 3 times, even 4 times a week. So that distribution is going to affect the local economies.
Thank you very much. And I invite Fran or Leo to add commentary on that, on any of the recession or uncertainty discussion.
Well, just to jump in, I think Jerry laid it out absolutely correctly. I think being cautious and careful is prudent in this time, and we have to recognize that we are uncertain time, both economically, politically, and it's not, to Jerry's point, it's not just here in the United States, but we are affected by world issues as well, which sometimes are harder to predict. So being cautious is key in this time.
Thank you. Leo, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so, I agree with Jerry about the extent of economic uncertainty that we're experiencing. Even at the forecast, we've been very cautious about thinking, are we headed into a recession or not? It really is dependent on how quickly inflation comes down. It depends on how quickly supply chains begin to ease. A lot of this is beyond the control of the Federal Reserve, right? It depends on geopolitical factors. It depends on what's happening in, between Russia and Ukraine. It depends on crop yields in South America. It depends on crop yields here in the US, right? So it's going to be very difficult for someone to be able to claim, look, we're definitely going to get a recession in 2023. It really does depend on how quickly inflation comes down, and therefore, how much the Fed has to react to try to get inflation to come down.
Yeah, let me add to that. Leo is spot on that the bulk, or at least a significant part of the inflationary pressures that we see today are beyond the control of the Federal Reserve. And in fact, Chairman Jerome Powell, when he was testifying before Congress, was asked about that. And his answer was clear and concise. No, raising interest rates won't affect these key items that are generating inflation. What will affect it is if we get interest rates high enough that it causes an increase in unemployment and more caution on the part of savers, so we get a pull back in consumption, then you will ease those demand pressures. So if the Fed does see inflation come down, the Fed can change its policy. And that's why we're looking at alternative impacts of Fed policy decisions as we go through 2023, because they're really using a very blunt instrument to address something that is very specific to sectors that have been having problems, such as food. Leo pointed out the droughts that are happening and the low yields around the world. You don't bring down food prices by raising interest rates, but you might bring them down by reducing the amount of income people have to spend on food and other items. So this is something that we all need to look at carefully as the data comes in over the next 6 months to a year.
Very good point. Thank you. Let's move into our next topic with Leo Feller, which is inflation and the supply chain.
Sure. So I think, as many of us have experienced personally, as we've seen in the news over the course of this past year, we've had some of the highest inflation this past year that we've had in the past 40 years. This is not something that we are accustomed to as consumers. We right now, inflation has started to slow down. It's at 7.7% year over year, down from a peak of about a little over 8.5% year over year. So inflation is beginning to ease, but nevertheless, 7.7% year over year inflation is not something that we've seen in 40 years' time. To talk about what has been driving this, it is a lot of excess aggregate demand and supply constraints. But we have to think about, where is this aggregate demand, right? The economy, even though it came roaring back from the pandemic, and we almost got a complete recovery in terms of the level of GDP, it's been very synchronized in the sectors and what has been driving the recovery. So I guess one of the best ways to think about this is, what have we seen inflation in over time? If you look at the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw some of the highest inflation in cleaning products, right? All those Clorox wipes, those Bounty paper towels that people were buying to be able to, clean their counters. We saw inflation in toilet paper. We saw inflation in food, right from the get-go. The next thing we saw some of the highest inflation in was things like ice cream and Oreo cookies and Cheez-Its, because we were all watching Tiger King and eating junk food during this period of the pandemic. And then at some point in time, we all became coordinated and we started making sourdough bread. And so we saw higher inflation in baking products and flour. And then we all started buying more furniture so that we could work from home for the extended period of time that we were going to be working from home. And we started buying more laptops so our kids could do homeschooling. We started going out a little bit more. And so, we started going to Home Depot and Lowe's and doing home remodeling. And so we saw more inflation in that sector. Then we saw, people going out and buying more cars because they didn't want to use public transit. And so the inflation that we've been seeing has been in very particular sectors over time. Initially, the thinking was that this was going to be transitory, right? Because we saw inflation only limited to a few select items of the economy at a time. Eventually, this has become broad-based, right? So what used to be just inflation in used cars, just inflation in snacks, just inflation in home remodeling supplies and in garden equipment has now become a much broader based inflation. And it has taken root in services. It has taken root in goods, as people are buying so many more goods over the course of this past year. It has started coming down on the good side of the economy. And so as people have gotten essentially saturated with the amount of goods that they purchased over the past year and have started shifting more towards buying services, goods inflation has eased. So all those imports that were coming through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, if you remember the news about the 100 or so tanker or ships, cargo ships waiting to unload outside of Los Angeles and Long Beach, right? That's no longer an issue. That's because import demand has started coming down. And we're trending down to a normal level of goods consumption. And in exchange, we're trending up back to a normal level of services consumption. As Jerry mentioned, we're going into the office a little bit more, right? We're engaged more in hybrid work. This means more services consumption as people are, consuming more childcare, consuming more doggy daycare as they're going into work more often, consuming more dry cleaning services, eating more at restaurants, traveling more as they're going into the office some more. So, collectively, this has led to a shift away from some of that goods inflation, but it has accelerated services inflation, right? One of the things that we've been talking about and we're seeing now is that it's going to be extremely costly to buy plane tickets to go see your family for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And part of the reason is that we didn't do this last year, right? Last year, we thought that there was going to be this, epic end of the pandemic, and we were all going to travel and see our families. And then we had the Omicron wave come in, and people actually scaled back and canceled a lot of their holiday travel plans. And we even saw in the way that people were purchasing gifts that people, bought fewer gifts to give in person, and they bought more gift cards that they could send to their family members since they weren't actually meeting up in person. Now we have a lot of this compensatory consumption, right? We are going out and taking those trips that we weren't able to take last year and assuming that we're not going to have yet another COVID wave, or we'll just react differently to it this time. Then, we expect to see people travel a lot more. And so you're seeing higher inflation and higher prices in a lot of these travel related and leisure and hospitality sectors. I think a lot of this excess demand is beginning to slow down, right? Consumers are now saving up about 4% of their disposable income every month, as opposed to the 7-8% that they were saving before. Consumers are actually drawing down some of their savings that they accumulated over the course of the pandemic. Earlier on, we had about 2.4 trillion, and this is going to be July of 2021. We had 2.4 trillion in excess savings. And what I mean by excess savings is that this is, savings additional to what people usually had prior to the pandemic, right? So people got stimulus checks, people didn't go out and spend, on services during the pandemic. And so people accumulated $2.4 trillion more than they normally had. We are now at about $1.8 trillion that people have in excess savings. And this is coming down pretty slowly, right? And we only expect this to be depleted by the end of 2024. This is still powering consumer spending. We just got a report from retail sales today that said that consumers were still going out and spending on clothing, on building supplies, on toys, on food services, going out to restaurants, on buying even more food for holiday celebrations. October candy consumption was through the roof, right? And so people for Halloween, right? People have actually really been going out and continuing to spend. And that makes it a little bit harder to contain inflation. So what can the Fed do to try to get inflation down, right? As Jerry mentioned, they have a blunt policy instrument, which is raising interest rates. What makes this a little bit more difficult right now is that so few people have variable rate mortgages, and so many homeowners were able to lock in fixed rate sub 3% mortgages that even as the Fed increases interest rates, there's this whole swath of the population that doesn't get affected, right? Their homes are locked in at fixed rate mortgages. Maybe they'll delay buying a car at higher interest rates. Maybe they'll delay their furniture and appliance purchases that they would normally finance. But really, there's a swath of the economy that's going to be fairly comfortable despite increasing interest rates. This falls on people who are renters, right? Because the higher interest rates go, the more difficult it is for you to buy a house, and the more you have to compete for rental apartments. It's more difficult for consumers that have to borrow, right? So if suddenly your car breaks down and you need to go out a new car, it's going to be more difficult for you given that interest rates are higher, right? And it's going to fall on people who are going to lose their jobs as businesses cut back on business investment. And so these people become unemployed and they're going to spend less. But this is really the tool that's at the Federal Reserve's disposal, is increasing interest rates, getting unemployment to be higher. And that is how they're going to convince people to cut back on spending, is more wariness about the economy. This is, and to use Fed Chair Powell's words, this need to exact some kind of economic pain on households and businesses to get people to cut back on the amount of spending that they've been doing. The Fed has said that they would rather err on the side of forcing a recession than to err on the side of letting inflation get out of hand. And so they specifically said, we're going to wait to see inflation actually coming down before we ease up on interest rates, right? We're starting to see inflation coming down, but we're not at that 2% level, which would signal that the Fed would, essentially relax a little bit on increasing interest rates. So I think, we still have a ways to go with monetary tightening. It might be the case that a lot of inflation just dissipates as supply chains begin to ease. But we've also seen inflation take root in services, in the service sector, and that's a lot harder. You can't really blame that on supply chain constraints, right? And so we need to see that services component of inflation start coming down. We need to see consumers pull back on some of their retail spending for it to signal that inflation will come down to the point that the Fed will ease off on increasing interest rates. The Fed has said that we probably still have a ways to go. Mary Daly, who's the president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, and usually one of the most dovish members of the Federal Open Market Committee that sets interest rates, she said today that we probably have another 100 basis points, right, which will get us close to a 5% Federal Reserve terminal interest rate. That means that mortgage rates will probably be above 7%. And so that's the kind of monetary tightening we still will likely get before inflation or before the Fed begins to ease, if inflation doesn't start coming down more quickly.
Got it. Thank you. And I apologize. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback with my mic when my mic's on. So, but thank you for taking us through that, Leo. We do have a question. So is there a parallel? Can you talk about any tension with China and how that affects our inflation?
Yeah, so I think earlier when we were still doing a lot of this goods consumption, every time China would have some kind of lockdown related to its COVID-0 policy, what would end up happening is that meant even more supply constraints, right? Imports becoming more expensive because we weren't getting that production from China. We are no longer importing quite as much, right? There are some indications perhaps that China is going to ease on its COVID-0 policy, but we haven't seen too many clear signs that they're going to relax and have kind of the COVID tolerance that we have in the US or in Europe. I think there has been a little bit of a downgrade in some of these tensions with recent conversations between President Biden and President Xi. And we've also seen that US companies are becoming a little bit more risk averse. And it's not that they are reshoring production from China to the US, but they are considering, if we are going to expand our factories, where else do we expand so that we are not at risk? And we've seen Apple saying that they're going to expand into India. We've seen companies say that they're going to expand production in the US, right? So a lot of auto manufacturers, semiconductor manufacturing here in the US. And so there is a little bit of a diversification so that we are not as prone to the risk of U.S.-Chinese relationships degrading and that causing potentially higher inflation and more pain for U.S. consumers.
Let me add a little bit to that. So the 20th Party Congress just concluded, and in Xi Jinping's very long speech, he said zero COVID policies are working and we're going to continue with them. Though it appears that what is actually happening is in China, eventually there's going to be herd immunity because of the spread of infection. That's going to take time. But what we are also seeing happening in China is really a resiliency of the private sector in China. So as ports close down, there are now workarounds. So when the port of Shanghai closed down for zero COVID, goods were shipped to Ningbo or shipped to the Pearl River Delta and came out. Takes a little bit longer. And we are also seeing companies that are producing in China for export, not for the Chinese market. So that excludes, for example, Tesla and GM that produce for the automobiles for the Chinese market, that they are within China diversifying their production. And so iPhones, which were mostly made in Anhui province, are now going to be made in several provinces so that if the factory is shut down, as it was a couple of weeks ago, Foxconn is going to still be producing those iPhones for export. So there are workarounds. The kicker with respect to China is the reshoring of manufacturing, some of which is being induced by American policy, such as the CHIPS Act. That takes time. You can't build a factory in a day. A factory usually takes about 3 years. Maybe you can accelerate it. We are seeing those factories going up here and elsewhere. Supply chains are really expensive to move. And what it means is that as we look forward into 2024 and 2025, we're going to see price increases on all of those things that are related to decoupling the US economy from these very efficient supply chains that were developed over the previous 25 years. So we do have that kind of price increase, not necessarily overall inflation, but price increase in the future because of the tensions with China.
Got it. Thank you very much. This next question, this one's addressed actually to Fran. How can cities stretch their revenue dollars and get value for their spending?
It's an important question. In our work with so many cities across the country, I think what we're learning and seeing is cities are very cognizant of what their revenues are, what their rainy day funds are, what the reserves might look like, and already have been very proactive going into this period of time, anticipating having to be careful with how they spend. We're doing a lot of forecasting work with Pacific cities, looking at their individual city bases and helping them tweak their forecast going forward. And most cities that we work with are definitely taking the conservative view on the monies. I think the key thing we're sharing with them is to be so careful that you're not spending one-time monies, because we've received so much from the stimulus monies, the Recovery Act. Those monies are starting to dissipate, so that becomes part of the question about going forward. So making sure you don't spend this one-time money on ongoing services or programs. That's where many cities can get in trouble. Sticking to fundamentals and prioritizing is the other big key. And I think it's also important for cities to really stay close to their business bases. They're struggling. They need to know that the cities are supporting them, and each city's base is very different from another, but being close there and trying to provide them support and balance is really good. And then just in general, Moody's did a stress test of the state's fiscal ability to weather a moderate recession type of activity, and 39 states are in pretty good position to do well. And I think that translates to the local level. Generally, if states are doing well, it equates to the cities within that state to doing well as well. and only about 7 states were really not well prepared based on their analysis to do, to weather the storm. So fundamentals, watch your one-time spending, and be very conservative, I think, are the answers.
All right. Thank you. And this one I throw out to all of you. So eventually inflation is going to go down. Eventually it's going to correct itself. When it does, are we going to go back to pre-inflation prices?
No. I mean, that's a simple answer. And so why do I say no so quickly? Along with a general increase in prices has been a general increase in wages. And then so in what we call real terms, what we economists call real terms, which is inflation adjusted, consumers are in a position to pay those higher prices. Now, some prices will come down. So, for example, in the new automobile sector, we've seen these premia that have been placed on autos because auto manufacturers have not been able to produce due to a chip shortage. As they start increasing their inventories, we'll see prices come down. In another area that it is possible, but I wouldn't want to speculate it's going to happen, is food. We have had poor harvests in the US, in Northeast Africa, in India, in China, and of course the war in Ukraine has interrupted food supplies. If we get good harvests of grain, then prices will go down. And in that regard, here in California, in Southern California, which everyone thinks of as a desert, there was a 10-year period when there were poor harvests of grain throughout the world, like we're seeing today. And Southern California was the grain belt. But then prices came down, and that ended up collapsing. So we may be, with climate change, in for higher food prices for the long run. But in general, the price level is not going to drop back to 2015. Some goods maybe, others are going to stay high or go higher.
That is not what any of us wanted to hear, I am sure, but thank you for that. And I'll remind everyone that you just deliver. You don't make the forecast, you don't make the news, but you're just delivering what's going to happen. So
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm just looking at the data.
So, Jerry, why don't you take us to our next section, which is the housing market?
Sure. So we've been talking about the Federal Reserve having this blunt instrument, interest rates, but it does affect housing. In terms of economic activity, the most important part of housing is the production of new housing. And so higher interest rates make it harder for individuals to buy existing homes. That affects the economy because it affects the incomes of the brokerages, mortgage brokers, and realtors, and those who are in associated lines of business. That's certainly very personal for them, but in terms of the aggregate economy, it's not very large. What is large and what is typically associated with recessions is the construction of new homes, and higher interest rates means fewer new homes will be built. As we look across the country, we see that starting to have an impact, but it's really a differential impact depending on where one is. So when we look at the desert Southwest, where or the Basin and Range region, if you will, where many people migrated to during the pandemic and afterwards, and there was a flurry of home building, we're seeing much softer housing markets and a decline in new home production. In some other states where that didn't happen, such as California, we're actually seeing some increase in building, partly due to new laws that make it easier to build duplexes and ADUs. And in Texas, which never really caught up with the migration, we're seeing increases in building. So it's very mixed as you go across the country. But when you add it up across the country, you do get a decline in home building. One aspect of this that is different in some places is the impact of climate change. So we're expecting an increase in building in Florida, for example, unfortunately, and an increase in building in some parts of the West that have been hit with wildfires.
Thank you, Jerry. Why don't you bring us back so we can all come and comment on that? So interesting that you said that you're seeing different things across the country, but giving that that overall perspective. So our larger areas like Texas, Arizona, Nevada, Florida, California. Fran, do you have any insight into what's happening in those markets for
Yeah,
housing?
yeah, I think those are the key states. Phoenix and Las Vegas and Austin, we're growing at more rapid paces than other parts of the country. As an example, we saw, right now we feel the markets are overvalued in those areas, and so they're starting to really come down very dramatically. In Phoenix, they're overvalued anywhere from 40 to 50%. And now we're starting to see declines coming back in 20 and 30%. So it's, to Jerry's point, it's very specific areas are having impacts more so than others. But I think places that grew faster are feeling the impacts now. And those communities are also impacted a lot by tourism and entertainment, travel, things of that nature. So they tend to be hit more dramatically.
Yeah, in general, housing markets are not going to see the kinds of contractions that we saw in between 2006 and 2010, because we are not overbuilt in homes in most of the country. And that does include places like Phoenix and Austin and Boise. There's a little bit of catch up. There's going to be a little bit of softness in the market, but it's not an implosion like we had before.
Correct.
All right, thank you. I want to make sure we get to our last topic here, which is unemployment, that Leo's going to take us through. Leo?
Sure. So the unemployment rate right now stands at 3.7%. These are like pretty near historic lows, right? We've had a fantastic recovery in employment. Much faster than many of us thought were going to happen. When we think back to 2020, 2021, we thought it would take us maybe until 2025 until we had a recovery like we've experienced just over the course of this past year and a half. As Jerry mentioned earlier, this is not consistent with us being in a recession, because the labor market over the course of this past year has continued to add workers month after month after month after month. We are starting to see layoffs happen in the tech sector. And this is what's getting a lot of attention, right? You hear about Amazon and Twitter and a lot of these tech companies laying workers off. But importantly, this is not broad-based, right? This is not happening in the retail sector. This is not happening in government. The fact that you are having these job losses in tech also means that other companies are going out and hiring these tech workers. And so we haven't seen initial claims for unemployment shoot up, even as we've heard about layoffs, because the job market is still so tight that a laid off worker in one sector or from one company goes out and finds a job very quickly in that same sector or in an adjacent sector. What this means is that, overall, workers, consumers, have more money to spend. One of the big drivers of the inflation and of the consumption that we continue to see, the resiliency of the consumption that we continue to see, is that people feel pretty confident that they will be able to go out and get a job, right? We've seen the number of job openings still remain pretty elevated. It has come down slightly, but you still have almost 2 job openings for every unemployed worker. And that simply means it's very easy for workers, even as they are being laid off from certain tech jobs, to be able to go out and find a replacement job. The Federal Reserve has actually signaled that the labor market is, as they put it, unhealthily tight. These were their exact words, unhealthily tight. There are too many job openings for the number of workers who are unemployed. And that means that workers have a lot of leverage, right? They can command higher wages. And if they're commanding higher wages, then that is feeding into inflation, because employers are passing on these higher labor costs to consumers. Right now, our view is that, depending on the scenario that we take, a scenario where the Federal Reserve has to keep tightening interest rates because inflation isn't coming down quickly enough, we might get unemployment up to around 5%, right? Or maybe a little bit above 5%. That's one scenario that's consistent with a recession scenario, right? Where the economy has to slow down to such a degree to get people to stop consuming at the extent they have been consuming, that unemployment is going to shoot up, right? The other scenario is that we have, in a way, immaculate disinflation, right? Inflation begins to come down. Not only do supply constraints ease, but a lot of the constraints associated with food production dissipate, and that means that prices begin easing a lot faster. In that scenario, we really don't think that unemployment is going to have to make it all the way up to 5% in order for us to get disinflation, right? And so here we might actually see unemployment go up maybe to the low 4%. But again, in an environment where companies are still aggressively trying to hire and retain workers, and where workers feel pretty confident about whether or not they will have a job 1 year, 2 years from now. And that signals that they can go out and consume things like cars and furniture and buy homes because they feel confident that they can make the payments on these larger purchases.
Thank you. So you said unemployment is at 3.7% currently, correct?
Right.
So, and then the Meta laid off 11,000 people, Twitter 50% of its workforce, and then Amazon just mentioned that they were just announced they were going to cut 10,000 jobs. So do those factor in? Because all those were in the last couple of weeks. So probably was that before the 3.7%?
So this will
number or no?
Likely come in the next employment report that comes out in the beginning of December. But one thing to note is that we have data on initial claims for unemployment. A lot of these workers that are getting laid off from tech companies, first of all, they have severance, right? You're seeing this in Meta announcing, 3 to 6 months of severance pay, right? Twitter announcing 3 to 6 months of severance pay. This means that they're not going to go in and immediately start collecting unemployment. So they're not going to come into the initial claims for unemployment, but they might come into the unemployment report because they'll say, look, I'm looking for work, but I'm not currently employed, right? A lot of these people might say, look, I'm actually not even looking for work because I have the severance package, so I don't count as unemployed yet. So this will come into the unemployment numbers over the course of the next several months. In order to count as unemployed, you actively have to be looking for work. And it might be the case that a lot of these people who were laid off but have severance are going to start looking for work immediately. It might be the case that a lot of these people that were laid off and have severance are going to wait a month or two until after the holidays to start looking for work. This should bring a little bit of an increase to unemployment, but again, the labor market is still so tight that people are becoming unemployed from Meta and from Twitter, but they are able to find jobs in other tech companies very easily, right? Tech hiring has been incredibly constrained. And it has been these very large players that have been very successful in hiring, right? Amazon, Facebook have dominated hiring over the course of this past year. And so now they're beginning to lay off from the excess of hiring that they did. But there are still several smaller tech companies that weren't able to hire just because this was such a competitive environment. And so I'm not too concerned that this the increased layoffs in tech is going to become this broader contagion that the entire tech sector is laying off, or that because the tech sector is slowing down, other sectors of the economy are going to start slowing down because you still have, even these people that have gotten laid off, they still have severance pay. They still have the ability to consume for several months going forward. And again, the economy is still doing well enough that it's fairly easy to find replacement jobs.
And let me add some data to that. I mean, these headlines make good press, but if you add up the numbers and compare that to the number of people who are employed, it doesn't move the needle at all. In the state of California, where not all of these layoffs, but at least some of them are occurring at these large companies, employment in tech has been growing every month. So yes, there are layoffs, it makes headlines, but exactly as Leo said, those folks are just moving into other opportunities. So that's the first. The second is When Amazon says they're going to lay off 10,000 people, that's across the world. And so it's very diffuse. The places where you would expect to see the most impact are going to be the state of Washington and the state of California. And we're not seeing it. So the headlines are interesting, but unless you do see contractions in major sectors, you're really not going to be seeing a big spike in unemployment. So I would be looking at construction workers more than tech workers. And if we start seeing big layoffs of construction workers, which we're not seeing, in fact, our expectation is the opposite. But if we start seeing that because of high interest rates, then you're going to see unemployment rates spike up. What we're seeing in Amazon's going to lay off 10,000 people over this next 6 months. It doesn't move the needle.
And interestingly, there's been so much more hiring from the retail side, right? So retailers are expecting still a strong season. So Walmart is hiring more, Costco is hiring more, Macy's is hiring, right? You're still absorbing, some of this is seasonal, right? But you're still actually getting this impulse from higher retail spending and having these other sectors of the economy pick up. Right, we're still at near record low levels of youth unemployment. This has never been a better time for being a 16 to 19-year-old trying to find a job, because the labor market is just so tight that these jobs are widely available. So we do have to think about this as not just being, what we're seeing is very concentrated in tech. It hasn't spread to things like leisure and hospitality. It hasn't spread to manufacturing. It has not spread to construction. And this is a little bit of our optimism that unemployment is not likely to, skyrocket to, 5-6% anytime soon.
Right. And just to add on we've been focusing a lot about the need for quality workers and filling positions on the private side. It's an equally challenging problem on the public sector side as well. Local governments, I know in our work, we're constantly getting asked, do we have any thoughts about people who might be available to help? We're seeing a lot more of an outsourcing type of approach taking place to fill some of those gaps, so employees in cities can be utilized for other tasks. It's a widespread problem. The demand for high quality people is public and private sector both, very definitely.
Well, thank you very much. And that takes us, gentlemen, to the top of the hour. Every time I spend time with each of you, the time just flies by. Thank you so much for your insight and for your energy and for enlightening us all. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining in today. If you have any other questions for our speakers or for Avenue, for UCLA Anderson Forecast, email us at succeed@avenueinsights.com. We will make sure the messages get to the right person and get back to you. Until then, thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.